pastor de la iglesia Movimiento Avivamiento Mundial. Pues para que usted tenga una idea, la casa del oso, de acuerdo a la información suministrada por ellos, dice que han sido Sean todos bienvenidos a este directo con tu hermano y amigo Gabito Rodríguez. Un gran abrazo, pueblo. Doy gloria al Señor por la gran bendición que Él me concede de estar con todos ustedes en este preciso momento. No esperaba salir en esta hora, pero pueblo, la situación, pues hemos estado dándole seguimiento a lo que está ocurriendo. Algunos medios han decidido guardar silencio, pero esto es muy serio para el mundo entero. Nosotros como iglesia del Señor debemos ser los que estemos más alerta que nadie, porque es la orden escritural que nos dice a nosotros que debemos mirar. Mirad cuando vean estas cosas, erguíos vuestras cabezas, porque vuestra redención se acerca. Y si no vemos las cosas con claridad, ¿qué le podemos pedir al que no conoce a Cristo y no tiene ningún tipo de conocimiento de la profecía? Hay una profunda tensión en la casa de El Oso, la casa de Putin, ese territorio que está en este momento experimentando situaciones increíbles. Cabe tocar este punto y definirlo muy claro, porque una de las grandes advertencias que hizo el jefe de la casa es que de sentirse o verse amenazado, ellos van a tomar medidas descomunales y fuera de este mundo. Y que ayer hicieron una salvedad y dijeron que nos acercamos a un apocalipsis de índole catastrófico. La Biblia nos enseña que los últimos días de la humanidad serían días catastróficos, tanto en el periodo de principio de dolores, que es el que estamos en este momento, como en lo que son las semanas 70 de Daniel, periodo de la gran tribulación que este mundo va a ver muy pronto. Jamás de los jamases yo había sentido esta temporada más clara que nunca. Y no tengo la menor duda de que lo que está ocurriendo en este momento es único. Pues para que usted tenga una idea, la casa del oso, de acuerdo a la información suministrada por ellos, dice que han sido atacados de alguna manera por drones que han llegado no a la costa, a la frontera, sino directamente a la casa del oso. Escuche bien todo lo que me están viendo y los que están claros con esta temática, porque ni de esto ya podemos hablar con claridad. A ese nivel está esto. Y la casa ha recibido 8 visitas no deseadas. Y recuerde que lo que dijeron ellos es que de ser de alguna manera amenazado, o que la seguridad del territorio sea amenazada, pues ellos estarían respondiendo de una manera contundente, y hablaban, pueblo, de una situación que tuviera que ver con un apocalipsis. Y cuando usted utiliza los términos bíblicos de esta magnitud, pues tremenda. Los que me están viendo, de acuerdo a la noticia internacional que está ocurriendo, pues dicen que 8 drones llegaron hasta la casa del oso mayor, y hay en este momento una serie de situaciones. Yo no confío en nada de lo que diga el oso mayor, no confío en nada de lo que diga, porque ellos también pueden crear una serie de cosas, pero tampoco dudo de que esté ocurriendo todo esto. Pero lo que sí es, pueblo, importante es que el mundo no avanza a entender que vivimos un momento sin precedentes, y de que Rusia cumpla cada una de sus advertencias al mundo, pues nos llevaría a nosotros a entender qué hora es, qué está sucediendo en el reloj profético del Señor, que el mundo día tras día va avanzando en esta temporada altamente profética sin precedente. Honestamente, la situación, pueblo, tiene a todas las naciones y a los países europeos mira, hermano, ellos están en este momento en alerta máxima, observando el comportamiento. Pero no se olvide que desde que inició todo esto, el oso mayor dijo que de haber y sentirse que su territorio pueda verse en peligro, iba a haber una respuesta. Y ayer dijeron que será una apocalíptica. Yo no sé cómo usted puede ver y definir todo esto. Si lo va a hacer o si no lo va a hacer, yo no lo sé. Pero yo no tengo por qué recostarme hacia atrás y decir nada ocurre. Yo sí le tengo que decir a todos y cada uno de ustedes, el panorama bíblico establece que escucharíamos de guerra, rumores de guerra, escucharíamos que naciones se levantarán contra naciones y reinos se levantarán contra reinos. En otras palabras, todo puede suceder en este preciso momento. Y esto es solamente uno de una cantidad de situaciones que se están dando en uno de los momentos más increíbles. Nosotros creemos y le decimos a todos ustedes que de alguna forma seamos la voz de Dios para este tiempo final. Este mundo necesita voz de Dios. Voces que le digan a la gente lo que está sucediendo. Comparta esta información. Estos son videos sumamente importantes de toda la información que nos está llegando. No se duerma. En cualquier momento vamos a estar escuchando cosas terribles, cosas impresionantes que pueden marcar directamente la vida de todos y cada uno de nosotros a nivel internacional. Ya las naciones gatean en crisis profunda, económica, alimenticia, protestas en las calles, otros conflictos en otras naciones, y todo esto es perfectamente conectado a la profecía escritural que nos muestra el momento increíble que estamos viviendo. Por eso es que es tan importante que se levanten las voces, los hombres de Dios. Dios siempre ha tenido hombres a lo largo de la historia. Dios siempre ha levantado voces, hombres claros y fuertes. Lo que acaba de pasar es que llegaron unos drones a la casa del oso y han causado pues situaciones fuertes y se espera una respuesta. Ya han dicho que la respuesta va a ser apocalíptica. Ya usted sabe lo que significa todo esto. El mundo necesita que la iglesia hable. La dirección correcta de este mundo, el único que la tiene es la iglesia. Ni políticos, ni científicos, nadie. La iglesia tiene la voz y sabe con claridad hacia dónde nos lleva la brújula de la profecía de los últimos tiempos. Aquí nadie más tiene dirección. Nadie más. Solo la iglesia. La iglesia sabe lo que está pasando. La iglesia sabe lo que está sucediendo. La iglesia sabe lo que viene. Por eso es que es tan importante que seamos ese instrumento de Dios para este tiempo final y compartamos la información. Yo voy a estar al pendiente. Es muy difícil, pero aquí estamos con todos ustedes día a día. Esto no se trata de asustar mi gente. La gente... O sea, las noticias están hablando esto, los medios están hablando esto, pero la iglesia no puede hablar esto porque la gente siente que se está asustando. Ningún cristiano tiene miedo. Yo no tengo miedo. Yo estoy tranquilo. Si alguien tiene miedo, tírese a orar para que se le vaya el miedo. Nosotros los cristianos estamos advirtiendo. Si es por miedo, pues quitemos Apocalipsis, quitemos el libro de Daniel, quitemos los libros proféticos, saquemos Mateo 24, Lucas capítulo 21 y Marcos capítulo 13 para que la gente no le dé miedo. Estamos diciéndole que esto es lo que dice la Biblia. Se acaba el tiempo, corre a Cristo. Si tiene miedo, busque un rincón de oración y aprenda a confiar en Dios, porque los cristianos no andamos con miedo. Nos vemos luego. Dios me lo bendiga. Dios te bendiga, te habla tu hermano y amigo Gabito Rodríguez, pastor de la iglesia Movimiento Avivamiento Mundial en la ciudad de Isabela, Puerto Rico.
Next build. Hit space. Yeah, okay, so this video was recorded by pilots deployed from the aircraft carrier USS Theodore Roosevelt in 2015. The example has been given the nickname Go Fast because it gives an impression of an object moving very rapidly against the ocean surface. And, the question is this impression correct? And, if not, what can we say quantitatively about what that object is doing in kind of Earth-centered coordinate system? Fortunately, the information needed to determine the altitude and velocity of this object is contained on the display. So go ahead and next. And this includes the elevation angle of the camera, the azimuth angle of the camera, the target range in nautical miles, aircraft altitude, the time reference in seconds, indicated airspeed in knots. This information in this video in particular has been discussed quite a bit on the web. So let's begin with the object altitude. Next, please. So knowing the jet's altitude and the bearing to the target, we can apply basic trigonometry to figure out where that object is in altitude space. And it turns out to be, provided the range information is accurate, which can have some uncertainties associated with it, but the object appears to be at about 13,000 feet. An important aspect of this here is that it's sort of midway between the jet and the ocean. So the ocean that looks like it's right behind it is actually 4.2 miles away. And this is our first indication that some or most of the motion that we observe, the apparent motion of the object, is in fact due to the rapid motion of the sensing platform, which is about 430 miles per hour in this case. But we don't have to guess about this. So we have enough information on the display to actually reconstruct the encounter. Go to the next slide, please. And so this is what this is. This is using additional information on the screen, including the time axis. And so we know that this aircraft is banking about 15 degrees left, and you can compute through a simple calculator the approximate radius of curvature of the flight. And the bottom line is, I won't go into detail here, but if you can get the bearing and range to the target at two locations with known separation and time, you can figure out how far it moved. And in this case, this object moved about 390 meters in 22 seconds, and that corresponds to a velocity of just 40 miles per hour. And so that's a velocity that's consistent with wind speeds at 13,000 feet. So it's not our task to conjecture what this object is, but it's an example that illustrates the type of data needed to determine critical parameters that will help us identify such objects going forward. In addition to the importance of quantitative analysis, this example also serves to illustrate the kind of cognitive bias we have to contend with for UAPs recorded from unfamiliar perspectives. And Sean Kirkpatrick showed another example of that. This is a parallax effect case. Thank you. Any questions?
Thanks. Actually, before we have questions, this is actually a good moment. Sean had wanted to comment on one of the questions. If we bring Sean up and then take questions for everybody or more discussion.
Thanks. That was actually very helpful for everyone, I'm sure. Just one piece of clarification on the video that we showed. The second one that was the newly released one had the three aircraft in it. The question was asked about if it was a stabilized background against which the jitter was showing. I am not 100% certain of that answer. It might just be a bunch of dust on that sensor, but let me go back and get you a more fulsome answer. It is either stabilized background or it's just garbage. But in either event, the three aircraft are jittering because of the platform. But that's another example of exactly what you're saying, right? It's the perception of the operator who thinks it's doing something else when it's actually just your own camera. Right.
Yeah, if I could just, Sean, in your event, it seemed to me that what you mean by jitter in this case is the plane is actually making motions that are causing a parallax.
So it's actually more than that. So the plane will move, and that'll cause the parallax that you just showed. But the sensor itself a lot of these cameras are in gimbals. For those of you not certain what a gimbal is, it's the thing that your cameras sit on, your telescopes sit on, it moves it around in different directions. Those can sometimes be stabilized, in which case they damp out the motion of the platform. And in other cases, they're not, and they jump around. And so what you're actually seeing in that video is what we call jitter of the sensor against the platform. So the platform's moving and the sensor is moving. It's not a stabilized against the target. But once it's collected, sometimes in processing, the background is stabilized frame to frame, just like some of those TikTok videos you see, right? Same idea.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in here. I think make a couple of comments to just follow up on what Josh said. In my experience of flying, over 15,000 hours, 30-something years in airplanes and both in space, and the environment that we fly in, space or an atmospheric flight, very, very conducive to optical illusions. So I get it why these pilots would look at that go fast video and think it was going really, really fast. I remember one time I was flying in the warning areas off of Virginia Beach, military operating area there, and my Rio thought, the guy that sits in the back of the Tomcat, was convinced we flew by a UFO. So I didn't see it. We turned around. We went to go look at it. It turns out it was Bart Simpson, a balloon. Oftentimes in space, I would see things and I was like, oh, that's really not behaving like it should. It doesn't have the trajectory of a satellite or a planet on the back of the star field. And every single time when I would look at it long enough, I would realize that it was atmospheric lensing. It was the fact that what I was looking at was actually flying behind the atmosphere, and because of variations in the atmosphere, it made the trajectory look like it wasn't going in a straight line. It was going like this, and it would go like that, and it would turn in the other direction. Was always the case. My brother, Mark Kelly, a former NASA astronaut, and also now a U.S. Senator, I was with him for dinner last night, and he shared a story with me again that he had shared years ago, but I had kind of forgotten about it, and I think it's worth sharing. And that is when he was the commander of STS-124, I think it was, in 2008, they were getting ready to close the payload bay doors of the space shuttle. And before they do that, you got to make sure nothing interferes with the doors, because if the doors don't close properly, the space shuttle can't re-enter the atmosphere. It would come apart. It's part of the structural integrity of the vehicle. So they see something in the payload bay, and they thought it was a tool, maybe a bolt. They couldn't quite figure it out. They were potentially going to have to go and do a spacewalk to retrieve it. But before they did that, my brother grabbed the camera, they took a picture of it, and when they blew up the picture, they realized that this is not a bolt or a tool in the payload bay. It was actually the International Space Station that was 80 miles away. I mean, that's just a really good example of how this environment we operate in is so conducive to optical illusions. Oftentimes, guys fly into the water. And there are cases where, pilots have rendezvoused on a buoy because they thought that was their wingman. It's just very, very challenging environment to work in, especially at night. And in my experience, the sensors kind of have the same issues as the people's eyeballs.
So per what Scott just said, I think we need to take it as an action to investigate unidentified animated phenomena to go after Bart Simpson. I think what Josh and Scott said is very, very helpful and shows why we need multiple sources of data. Were there radar hits? Were there other sightings? Unless we can look at this from a holistic perspective, it's very difficult to draw conclusions. And relative to stigma, and I appreciate the reports that our colleagues gave, I think there's plenty of stigma right here in this building. I'm sure Dan suffered from it at times. And I just want to commend Administrator, although he's always be Senator Nelson to me, for his leadership and candidly courage in getting asked to tackle this issue. And as we look at what Sean had articulated, that what he wants NASA to do, as we look at the recommendations for reporting, how we need to collate that reporting, I'm very concerned that this could be effectively done on an ad hoc basis. And I've been a part of far too many panels and studies that end up sitting on the shelf. I don't want this to be one of those exercises. And we can discuss this further, but I would call for and recommend a permanent office within NASA to support this activity, albeit likely a modest one, but to collate this information, collate that data, to archive the information, and act as the open, forward-facing counterpart to Sean and AARO. I think then we could continue and actually accomplish the reporting, the stigma issues that have been raised, and we could do so in a relatively affordable fashion. Because again, I don't want all of our work to end up being in vain.
So now, Jen's going to turn to our charge. And you know, as a panel, when we were convened with a set of questions that we were charged to address, we've been addressing them through the topics we've talked about and through things as we've been thinking this through, but we're going to organize the next part of the discussion with Jen presenting these things, and this is also a chance to get into some of the discussion phase, because we can look at each of these questions as the topics that we want to make sure we address as part of the report. Jen?
Thanks, David, and I want to thank the panelists all for all of your work, all of the knowledge that I've gained from each of you through this time. I took it upon myself in preparing for today's meeting to draft a statement that answers the 8 questions that we were provided at the beginning of the last summer when the panel was created. So I'm going to read the question out loud. I'm going to read my statement, and I'm going to pause and let you think and reflect. And if there's, remember, this isn't all of the details associated with each of these answers, right? This is to be a kind of high level, make sure we've got the major points there. And this is an initial take for these answers. So the first question goes, what types of scientific data currently collected and archived by NASA or other civilian government entities should be synthesized and analyzed prior to potentially shed light on the nature and origins of UAP? So the panel reviewed data sources, analytic tools, data architectures from NASA, NOAA, FAA, Commerce, and others. The data that we recognized were not collected for the purpose of identifying UAP, which leaves bias in the data that was collected. Even though there is an immense amount of data available, it is hard to access, and the sensors that were used were not well calibrated for identifying anomalous phenomena. No questions. Moving forward. Question number 2. I kind of feel like Jeopardy. What types of scientific data currently collected and held by nonprofits and companies should be synthesized and analyzed to potentially shed light on the nature and origins of UAP? Many organizations exist to track sightings of anomalous phenomena in the Earth's atmosphere, both nonprofit, for-profit, and otherwise. The study panel concluded that much of the inputs collected by these organizations are not considered scientific data in nature, and that they do not contain unbiased information, they're not repeatable, and they typically come with eyewitness accounts, which we've heard even today, that there's hesitations with using only eyewitness accounts to recognize or identify UAP. To the point about commercial or companies, there are a lot of space companies that some lobbied hard to get in to present to us. They have troves of data, but they're collected for a variety of different purposes than the purpose of UAP. And those systems, while they are well calibrated, are only one source of many that could be used. And questions, comments, concerns? Yes, Carla.
I'll bite on that one, Jen. I think your answer is correct as to what we've seen, but where I would go is if we made a recommendation to NASA that, we're really asking them to build a roadmap, and we haven't done a robust cataloging. We've looked at sources, mentioned sources that we think might be relevant, but perhaps a more robust effort cataloging would be a good modest start.
Yeah, it's good. I will, only in slight defense of trying to answer the exact question as posed to the panel, rather than trying to add recommendations at this point. But yes, point well taken. Thank you.
I think one of the data sets that we learned about, heard more about today, and thinking about sort of calibrating things, is the FAA data on anomalous, tracking events, right? And I think this is something where if we had, some imaging software, people, citizen scientists with cell phone cameras identify some event that looks interesting, one of the places you'd like to be able to turn is the FAA data. And having, if there is, to go back to, having a NASA responsibility for data, NASA might, has a lot of experience in serving as a clearinghouse for data from across the government for civilian data, right? This is something we do in lots of different areas. And I think there are some opportunities with data sets there, and I think the radar data is one that comes to mind as one we don't want to forget about as an available data set.
Yeah, absolutely. Question 3, I think, goes more towards the recommendations of what other types of scientific data should be collected by NASA to enhance the potential for developing an understanding of the nature and origins of UAP. So we've heard now from 2 of the panelists on some of the information that should be collected, or the way that some of that data should be organized in a manner to make it available for people to analyze that information. And the only other thoughts that I had here was really recognizing the difference in the sensor thresholds, right? So we can't always tune a sensor all the way to the resolution that we might need or we might want. And as we collect that data, to recognize for the scientists that are doing those analyses the bounds of each of the systems that they're using. Yeah.
What strikes me on that one, when you were reading the answer, the proposed answer, was what may be new, may be something that's new to NASA in the sense of like a time series, so we can know what's normal, so we can perhaps identify what's not normal or anomalous, right? So I'm not sure to what extent it's like the most unsexy thing to sell on the face of the planet, right, is making consistent long-term observations. But I think that the agency may be set up to do just that for multiple reasons, right?
Yeah. Persistent data collection.
The agency does that in a lot of cases for astrophysical purposes. So the infrastructure, of course, pointing up and pointing at a different distance, but the infrastructure for collecting this kind of data, organizing and keeping it, and that does exist.
Yeah. And there are, in their defense, a lot of satellite companies that are doing that persistent collection as well. Okay. Question 4, which scientific analysis techniques currently in production could be employed to assess the nature and origins of UAP? Which types of analysis techniques should be developed? So this is a 2-part with what exists today and what should be. So we're looking also at recommendations. Based on the information provided by the presenters to the panel, there are very few credible analysis techniques available that currently exist to assess the nature and origins of UAP. The onset of artificial intelligence and automated analysis techniques give promise to being able to do that in the future.
I wanted to add something to that, perhaps, which is that really to design the analysis, you need to know what the data looks like, right?
Yes.
So, we can't really say what kind of analysis should be created on the hypothetical data that we are recommending should be collected in some, somewhat specified fashion.
If it's all hypothetical and we want
Right.
to collect all of this data and we know what format it's going to be in, we can design analysis techniques around it.
And at that point, it's likely that there are analysis techniques that already exist. There's
Absolutely.
a wealth of anomaly detection work. We just don't know which one will be most suitable because the data, as it should be, doesn't exist yet.
Correct.
She said exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah, and that's what I was getting at with my point. Not that those analysis techniques don't exist in the scientific community, just that they're not being applied to this problem set right now, and it's hard to apply them when we don't have the known data of what would go into those. David?
Yeah, I think something we want to stress here is the importance of uniform data
Yes.
in the way it's collected, because particularly when you're looking for outliers, if you have data coming from many different observing techniques, right, and just having a uniform set of cameras, a uniform set of detectors, so you understand and characterize them, right? But this is a needle in the haystack problem, and every camera. I mean, I'd mentioned in the opening session ghosting in optics.
Yes.
That's going to be different in every different detector, right? And before we get to the analysis techniques, we want to make sure we design the data collection so that the analysis techniques can effectively be used on it.
Right.
David, can I take a slight issue with that, which is, it sounds like you're implying that you need a single way of collecting the data. I'd argue it's really you need to understand the various ways in which you're collecting the data and you're able to cross-calibrate across those different approaches. Because I seriously doubt that there is a single detector.
I think a handful of ways so that you're
Yeah.
well characterized. Things need to be well characterized to be useful, I guess is the way I would state it. And it takes time and energy to well characterize things. So that's I think the challenge.
So following up on both your points, I think it's where we can actually apply artificial intelligence. So we cannot apply artificial intelligence on the current data, but we can apply artificial intelligence in a way that we can design characteristics